We're going to continue today to celebrate brave ladies with the message, but I wanted to start with some congratulations. So we had some graduations take place this week for CU students, and we wanted to congratulate all of you. And if your parents are here or your family, we're glad to have you. Good job. If you're moving on, come say hi to us. We'd love to say goodbye, even if we've never met you. We like to know that you are here, and we can give you a high five at least on your way out. Also, for the rest of our students that just completed another year, congratulations to you. You finished another year. You're a year closer to graduation, which is great news. And I guess I could say the very same thing to our mothers in the room. You survived another year completed, and you're 1 year closer to graduation. But on a serious note, we want to say Happy Mother's Day. I wanted to take the chance as well. And we're going to honor moms today with our message and talking about some heroic ladies in history. But I want you to think about the special role of motherhood. And, you know, this is a complicated day for people, as Andy described. It usually doesn't turn out the way you thought it would, your life, right? Including your relationships. And so this day can be difficult for people. You're missing someone. You've had to give up someone. You're waiting for someone. But it doesn't change the fact that motherhood is really, really special. And that God loves the world through motherhood. And this could be biological mothers. This could be adoptive mothers. This could be grandmothers. But the scriptures also point our direction and our attention to being spiritual mothers and fathers. These are people that step into someone's life to help shape the future. I read this week this quote, I loved it. To be a mother means to be one that shapes a soul. And we all need certain women in our life that come along and use that feminine strength and virtue to help shape who it is that we're going to be. I think that's why Paul said to the Corinthians, he said, you know what? A lot of you have a lot of advisors, but it's better to have one spiritual father or one spiritual mother than many advisors. And that's very appropriate for the way our culture is today. We have lots of people that kind of give us advice, and then we go make our own decision. But it's better to have a parent. And there are spiritual parents around us. And so, really, this is, I'm going to share about a few ladies who all lived out heroic lives through motherhood. They were all unique moms. Some had kids of their own. Some did not. But we can all learn from this. And so, we're going to honor motherhood today. By the way, in the scriptures, we often refer to God as a he, but he is not a he or a she. He's spirit, isn't he? And that is why he likens himself to the care of a loving father, but also a loving mother. One example of that is Isaiah chapter 66, verses 12 and 13. Israel thinks they're alone. He says, oh, no, you're not alone. You shall nurse, carried in her arms, cradled upon her knees. As a mother comforts her child, so I will comfort you. It's this reassurance that God is with us, just as a good, loving mother is with us to nurture us and to shape our soul. All right, let me tell you about how we're going to go through the message today. It's a little different. This is what we call one of our heroes messages. And rather than taking a passage or one story from the scriptures and learning from it, we're going to learn from real life people who went before us, who lived out this Jesus life. That as they dealt with doubt and struggle and the losses of life and all of its struggles, they continued to follow Jesus in a way that at the end of it, and even during the middle of it, people were looking at him and they were joining the journey. Bright lights that shined during dark times. And so one vision for the hero's idea comes from a need. Today in our culture, we celebrate a lot of the wrong things, don't we? I mean, the things that get attention and fame a lot of times are all the wrong things. And we don't celebrate the virtuous, giving, loving people in our lives. We just simply celebrate the talented. And so we need other examples that can spur us on to go further and further in our unique journey with Jesus. And that's always kind of been the idea behind what, historical Christianity is referred to as the saints. We just simply call them the heroes. They are meant to be there to inspire us to keep on the journey. But they are also meant to be relatable enough to us that we could see ourselves in them so that we might not say, oh, you're so unique, I could never be like that. No, they're meant to be close enough to us in their struggles that we might be inspired and learn from their example. Now, in the scriptures, we see this idea of looking to heroes to find some inspiration. Hebrews chapter 12. After describing many heroes in the Jewish story, The author of Hebrews says this, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us rid ourselves of every burden and sin that clings to us and persevere in running the race that is laid out before us while keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the leader and perfecter of our faith. A lot of times we just spend our time thinking about those names that are mentioned in Hebrews 11, but did you know the great cloud of witnesses is made up of people just like you and me? And that you get to be a part of that cloud for other people, the inspiration. And so today we're going to look at 3 ladies, all through the role of motherhood in some form, shaped souls, changed the world. Now I want to say a few things to some ladies in the room who might be already objecting to this, because that's just how public speaking works. People object right before you start, all right? So it's such a fun challenge. Okay, so for the ladies in the room saying, hey, there's nothing heroic about me. All I do is stay home with my kids. Well, I've got a hero for you. And for the ladies in the room that say, I don't have kids of my own, we have a hero for you. And for anyone in the room that says, I have a past that will keep me from living a full life, from being used by God, we have a hero for you. So the 3 ladies we're going to share with you today, Susanna Wesley, Mother Teresa, and a lady named Maria of Paris, but her affectionate name is Mother Maria, and she's probably the one you know the least, but I'll tell you about her at the end. So we want to go through these stories and find a little bit of courage and inspiration for our lives. So let's start with Susanna Wesley. I may be introducing you to her for the first time, but but you certainly have experienced the legacy of this lady's life. Almost all of us in some manner have experienced her influence. Now we know her best because of her 2 sons, 2 men who changed the world, John and Charles Wesley, who were the founders and the leaders of what we know today as the Methodist movement or Methodism. And so we know that there are Methodist churches around. In some ways, they resemble what these guys started. In some ways, they don't. But historical Methodism was a movement that changed the world. It was a world-changing revival that started in England. But because England was so powerful and had the British Empire, it was able to spread around the world, including to 13 colonies across the Atlantic Ocean, America. So they had a profound influence just on our social life. Now, as is the case with all true revivals, there is some spiritual renewal that takes place, but there is also social change that happens. So if you're ever around something that they're claiming to be a revival and it's just a bunch of people praying and not people doing, it's not really a revival. And it will fade out. But if you're just around people doing and there's no personal virtue and there's no following Jesus at deeper levels, it's not really a historical revival. But what these guys led was. So let me mention a few of their accomplishments. The top of the list is the abolition of the slave trade and the end of slavery in England and the entire British Empire, which is no small feat, right? We know people like William Wilberforce and Hannah More. They were influenced by these men who happened to be sons of this incredible woman. The Methodist movement led to prison reform, the end of child labor in England. There were laws that were passed against cruelty to animals and the establishment of countless private organizations dedicated to caring for the poor and the suffering. In fact, new innovative methods were being developed on how to move people out of poverty and also out of addiction. Organizations like the YMCA were birthed out of this movement later on. And so many things that we now just take as part of life began at this time, and they did not exist in many places before this movement. Some of our traditions that we kind of practice here at Cornerstone trace some of their roots back to this family. So creative music, using creative words to worship, freedom to write new songs was really unleashed at this time. Small groups gathering in homes where you open the scriptures and you pray and you support one another and you talk about what God might be doing in your life. That was not always the case in all the circles. But because of her very innovative sons who learned from their very innovative mother, they were able to change the world. Let me mention a few things that you also know about these boys. So Charles Wesley, we're going to sing one of his songs here in a moment as I close. But he wrote some 900 hymns, and a couple of them, Hark the Herald Angel Sings and Come Thou Unexpected Jesus, are 2 that we sing at Christmas. John was one of the most famous preachers in history. At age 70, listen to this, he led 32,000 people to Jesus. We're told that wherever he went, a revival followed. He was just effective in communicating a beautiful message. And the gospel is beautiful in all cultures when it is told without all the baggage, which is a God that made you and loves you and moves towards us. And he does for us what we cannot do for ourselves so that we can live the life that we can't achieve on our own. I mean, it's a beautiful message. And so he shared this message, and he was 70 years old without a microphone, and that many people heard and responded. I mean, he was what you would call anointed and certainly gifted. Behind these two great men, great leaders, was an amazing mother. Now, there was also a dad behind them who wasn't so great, which made what their mother did even better. That's why many refer to her as the mother of Methodism. John would say that he learned more about Christianity from his mother than all the theologians in England. And it reminds me of Psalm 116, verse 16. You can see it behind me. Truly, I am your servant, Lord. I serve you just as my mother did. And that's the dream of every parent that's following Jesus, that our kids would say something like that, right? I followed just as my mom or my dad did. Very few humans have influenced the world more than this lady has. Eric Metaxas ends his biography on Wesley by saying this: anyone who believes that the life of a woman dedicated to her family must be less than optimal cannot know the story of Susanna Wesley. Despite poverty, illness, a difficult marriage, and heartbreak in endless forms, she used her intellect, her creativity, her time, her energies, and will in such a way that can hardly be reckoned. The world in which we live owes much of its goodness in it to her life. Now, what this lady did at home with her children was really amazing, and I'm only going to be able to tell you a little bit of it, a couple stories and some things that she did, but you can read more about her. There's a lot of things out there about her. But this lady was born in the 17th century. She was born to a family of ministers that were Puritans. She married a man that was a part of the Church of England, and I won't bore you with those details because they are very boring. Unless you're a history guy, then you like the details. But she married this guy, and they got caught up in kind of these new reforming ideas, which is what Methodism would become. It would become a reforming movement within the Church of England. She married a man, and they ended up having Samuel, and they had 19 children, but only 10 survived infancy. So, of course, it was a different time, right? She was one of 25 children. Very different time. My gosh, I think I might die. Exactly, you. I know. Labor was so hard for me. 4 times I endured that. 19 children, 10 died. So just imagine grief upon grief. And her life was filled with struggle. At the top of the list was this marriage that was really difficult. Her husband Samuel was hard to like. Not just by people in his church, which is the people in his church and the villages that they were sent, little bitty villages, 200 and 300 people. They didn't like him, but his family had a hard time liking him. He was so unpopular as a minister, his family was publicly mocked, including the children on one occasion. Their crops were burned, their cows were stabbed, and mobs surrounded their house one time and lit the house on fire. Little John nearly died. In addition to all this, 2 other occasions, the house burned down completely. She lived under horrible debt because her husband didn't know how to manage money and was actually thrown into debtor's prison. And he would often leave for months at a time, one occasion over a year, leaving her to take care of all of these kids by herself. Struggle after struggle, life was hard. Yet through it all, she persevered and stayed a dedicated mother. And her methods in educating her children and raising them to be godly, and we don't use that word very often because it's misunderstood, but it means to be like God, okay, to have his character and his fruit in their life, were very innovative, and her sons would learn from it and adapt some of those, and that's where this idea of methods or Methodism would come. You can read about her house rules that she taught her children. Some of them would be very great to have in our homes today. Along with all of her responsibilities of taking care of the kids' education, which she made sure the girls got the same education as the boys, she would meet with each of her 10 children once a week for a private appointment where she would give them instruction and nourishment, and she would often ask them this question, which is now synonymous with the Methodist movement: how is your soul? Every week, time with mom. With 10 kids. It was her way of not just leading a family, but leading and shepherding individual people, children who are different. If you would have gone to one of those Methodist meetings in the 18th century, you would have been asked, how's your soul? And it all goes back to this amazing mom. Her dedication to her children led to a number of different innovations. I just want to tell you one of them that has to do with that idea of connecting together in homes and small groups. So, there are different spiritual traditions and different faiths that maybe had a little of this, but kind of the evangelical tradition didn't have the practices of gathering in homes very often. It's very biblical. It goes back to the first century. You have Jewish families gathering together to take the Lord's, to remember him and to worship together. But it had stopped, and the church had assumed all kinds of hierarchical control. And so on one year, her husband went away to London, and a young temporary pastor showed up at the church and began to tank the church. And so there are no parallels to this today, all right, with him, okay? Some young pastor thinking he's hot stuff, tanking the church. And she's recognizing this and is not happy with what's happening. And so she decided to invite some of her friends and all of the children into her kitchen on Sunday evenings, where they would sit around and they'd read the scriptures and they'd discuss things and they'd pray together. As time went on, over 200 people in this small village began to show up at her house, and the meeting would spill out into the yard. And there they would just spend small time, or they would be together and spend quality time with smaller groups of people talking about things that mattered and encouraging one another. Well, as preachers often are, this one was very insecure, and he didn't like that Susanna's kitchen meetings were bigger than his services on Sunday morning. So he wrote to Samuel, her husband, and said, you need to get your wife to stop. So Samuel, being the coward that he was often, tried to convince Susanna to stop this. And this was her response. This is what I love about her. She had some fire to her, okay? So she says, if you do, after all, think it fit to dissolve this assembly, do not tell me that you desire me to do it, for that will not satisfy my conscience. But send me your positive command in such full and express terms as may absolve me from all guilt and punishment for neglecting the opportunity of doing good, when you and I shall appear before the great and awful tribunal of our Lord Jesus Christ. I told first service right there, this is going to be repeated in the wrong way in many homes around Boulder County. You better stop telling me that, or you're going to answer to God for it. Well, she shut her husband up and was able to keep these house meetings going. Now, think about it. She has these two little boys who started using this method to help people grow and understand God, and their first exposure to anything like it was their mom being innovative and creative and trying to care for them. She was amazing. Another thing the boys would get from their mom, and actually all of the kids, including the daughters, is just this dedication to your inner life. One of the themes we teach here at Cornerstone is the inner life and also the outer life. And so over and over again, we're told that she kept this evening appointment with God. She enjoyed Jesus. She enjoyed praying and reading the scriptures and being alone with him. And because of that, she was this centered person that always had a lot to give. And John often described, when trying to teach people about the importance of spending your alone time with God, said, my mother did it from age 17 to 72. Keeping this appointment. Another thing she did is, I think she had to do this because she had 10 kids, but she would often pray through the day, because you either pray a lot when you have that many kids at home or you medicate. And so she made a better choice. She's known for sitting down and putting an apron over her head, which was a sign to all the children that mom was praying, so be quiet. The boys thought that all mothers prayed that way. But over and over again, she demonstrated her life with God, the importance of that. You can read about the prayers of Susanna Wesley. They're published. And I want to read one of those, just small lines from one of those prayers. She was lonely, stuck at home, these little towns. Her husband is away. And this is a prayer she prayed one day and wrote it down. Enable me, Lord, to live so as to deserve a friend. If I never have one on earth, be thou my friend, for in having thee I shall have all that is dear and valuable in friendship. Beautiful prayers over and over again that we have. One neat thing about her and her husband is they persevered. So even though their marriage was difficult and he was hard to love, she kept loving him. Later on in life, as John and Charles were away at college, this is what Samuel wrote to them about honoring their mother. He said, you know that you owe to one of the best of mothers Often reflect on the tender and peculiar love your dear mother has always expressed towards you. The deep affliction, both of body and mind, which she underwent for both of you before and after your birth. The particular care she took of your education when she struggled with so many pains and infirmities. And above all, the wholesome, sweet, motherly advice and counsel which she has often given you to fear God, to take care of your soul as well as your learning, and to shun all vicious practices and bad examples. You will not forget to evidence this by supporting and comforting her in her age. And then he says this, in short, revere and love her as much as you will. She was a lady that needed revered. She would become a grandmother and also a widow. She would live with her sons in London, living in the famous foundry, where she would die with her kids around her at age 73. She is a hero, and she is a treasure, and she is an answer to anyone that says, I am just a mother or I am just a father. What a powerful calling God has given you. Now, the next lady I want to talk about comes from a different Christian tradition. Her name's Mother Teresa. Many of you have heard of her. I'm not going to give you many of the details of her life, but I do want to point out a few things, but they'll just remind you a little bit of who she is. She's an Albanian-born nun, very small lady, who at a young age was called into the ministry. She ends up in Ireland, where she learns English, and then soon makes her way to India, where she teaches in a school for about 16 years. She was commended as a very good teacher. She was good at her job, and a number of students really made progress under her care. But it was 18 years after first being called into her calling that she received what is now famously known as a call within a call. Okay? So this is what I want you to hear about this. Often, we think we got to figure out exactly what it is that God wants us to do, and so we stall until we figure out exactly what that is. Someone as meaningful and amazing as Mother Teresa took almost 20 years to figure out exactly what it is that God was calling her to do. So sometimes calling gets clearer and more defined as time goes on. Well, after she received this call within a call, she began to make some movement in that direction. She admits that she kind of resisted to God because the call was this. It was to leave the school, to move in among the poorest of the poor in Calcutta, and to care for them there while living among them. And so, like most people, you would object to something like that. Many reasons why that wouldn't work. And she was all by herself, and there was no missionary order or no Catholic order that would support it. So for 3 years, she went through all of the appropriate channels to get this order recognized by the Catholic Church. She waited 18 years, waited 3 more years, and finally she was able to go in and do what she was called to do, this terrible but also amazing work. She founded an organization that cares for the poorest of the poor while being among them. These ladies would be known as missionaries of charity, and what happened, which is really neat, and it shows just what a great teacher she was, many of her former students were the first to join her in that gritty, difficult work. Today, the missionaries of charity are in 126 countries, caring for the dying and unwanted. She would often quote Matthew 25, saying, this is about me and other people, but this is about me and Jesus. These are the words of Jesus. For when I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. And a stranger, you welcomed me. Naked, you clothed me. Ill, you cared for me. In prison, you visited me. She literally loved Jesus that way. The sisters that were with her would often describe this thing that she would say. She'd say, in the morning, I meet with Jesus as I worship and pray. In the afternoon, I meet with Jesus as I feed the hungry. I mean, what an integrated faith, the inner life and the outer life. By the way, that's where joy comes from, those two things meeting together. She began to receive recognition in the 1970s. A BBC author traveled to India to meet her. He was a self-professed atheist, but he wanted to tell her story, made her famous. 1979, she won the Nobel Peace Prize. By the way, that journalist who was an atheist came to be a dedicated follower of Jesus because of her. He would often say, but so would others, that one of the things that stood out as they would kind of observe Mother Teresa, but also all of these other sisters that were with her, they called it a gritty joy. So imagine the worst slum on earth, because that's what this slum was known as. And the people most alone, the dirtiest, the sickest, the most contagious. And then imagine these beautiful little women coming in, because they were almost all small in stature, coming in with joy on their face. And the gritty work day after day could not take away the joy that they had. So people would look and they would marvel and they'd say, oh my gosh, maybe there is something special, supernatural behind what they're doing. So more would join. Mentioned her integrated life. A lot of people didn't know for decades that she was a lady that also really struggled with faith and doubt. In 1997, she died, and her correspondence between her and her spiritual director were published. And that's the first time that many people realized that she struggled with doubt, and she wondered where God was. And at times, she wondered if God had left her. And she struggled with what she called the perceived absence of God in her life. You know, often here at Cornerstone, we talk about part of the journey is the struggle, right? And a lot of times when we're in the struggle, we just think something's bad. But actually, the struggle is part of the journey. Well, even someone like Mother Teresa struggled. Christopher Hitchens misread her writings and said, oh, this shows that she was actually an atheist and didn't believe in God. But there's a very big difference between denying the existence of God and struggling with the perceived absence of God, right? Very big difference. One of the things she's most known for is celebrating the small things, one person, one act at a time. She would often say, don't worry about doing great things, but do little things with great love. That's a quote our kids are getting in ministry right now, in children's ministry. This was catchy, but it had a lot of edge and depth to it. Don't worry about doing great things, but do little things with great love. She often said to leaders and those in power, including a couple of our presidents, she would look at him and say, faithfulness, not success. Or faithfulness over success. She demonstrated what one person can do, one act at a time, and its legacy. Metaxas, as he describes her in his biography of her, says, she showed us what can be done. In fact, it must be done by people like us. She was an incredible treasure. And a person that in many ways is like us, who, by the way, never had children of her own. But she was a spiritual mother to millions. Now, the last lady I want to tell you about is the one you probably know the least. Her name is Maria of Paris, or her affectionate name, Mother Maria. And she is the Orthodox Church's version of Mother Teresa, okay? She is an Eastern Orthodox nun who is responsible for the care of thousands of refugees and the poor and needy in the 1920s and 30s in Paris. But she is most well known for her death, because she was killed in one of the Nazi gas chambers in the final days of World War II. In 2004, she was officially canonized by the Orthodox Church, but in 1985, she received a greater honor, in my opinion, from Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Remembrance Center in Israel, and the Jewish people. She was recognized as one of the righteous Gentiles. And there is tribute to her there for her brave acts. She's also known for being very unorthodox among nuns. Now listen to this. This is an example of someone that has a past, okay? She was married twice and also divorced twice. She had 3 different children from 2 different men. She didn't live in a monastery, and she was often criticized for spending time with the working class men in Paris by drinking and smoking with them after work. She knew that these guys were causing problems and not saving their money or going home and taking care of their family or having families. And she knew that the only way that she could spend time with them outside of work was to sit and drink with them. So she was glad to do it. Now, her story is worth telling because her life is so much like ours. She had a past. Her life was messy, filled with mistakes, and it's complicated. She lost 2 kids before she died. So Mother Maria, born Elizabeth Palenko, was born into Russian aristocracy, and she enjoyed all the benefits that come with that title. So she was wealthy as a kid, educated. She was a young girl whose potential was developed. She really was somebody. She ran her family's prize vineyard. at the Black Sea. She became the mayor of that town, which was really unheard of at the time. And she was also a very talented poet who made her way all the way to the top of the literary Russian scene. And she, in fact, she was a part of the highest poetic guild in Russia. Her dad died when she was little. And she chose to move away from God. She believed that there couldn't be a God worth loving if he allowed things like this to happen. So she went through suffering like many people do and questioned her faith, walked away from God. She believed that the answer to the problems of the world were all found in politics and better organizing. And so during this time, something big was happening in Russia. It was the Russian Revolution, right? And things were kind of getting stirred up. And people were very, very nervous, but she gave herself fully to this thing, believing that this was the answer. Well, in 1923, the revolution occurred, and she didn't quite line up correctly with those that found the power. And she had to flee with her daughter at the time, with many other Russian refugees, to Paris. They made it some other places, ended up in Paris. While she was there, just living this struggling life as a refugee, her daughter died. And she divorced her second husband. And she describes in some of her writing that that's the type of pain that leaves a person changed forever. And she was changed. She began to kind of make what ended up being a quick journey back to faith in Jesus. And at age 34, she describes having a new vision for her life. So it was a little later in her life, not so young, that she received a new call. And it went like this. Since she could no longer be a mother to her daughter that she had lost, she would be a mother to all people, not just to her own children. To the outcasts of society, she would love them as a mother loves her own children. And this is what she would often spend time writing about, what real good mothers do. So mothers who are nurturing souls, they don't shame their kids. They don't push them away. But they also don't accept the things in their life that are hurting them, right? So they learn how to live with like grace and truth. And she would often say, I will love them with the love of a mother, which means I will love them enough to help them change so that they do not stay in the place that they're at. And so addiction and hopelessness, she believed people needed to be moved through that. That's what mothers do. And so she would live this out, and she would start dozens and dozens of homes for poor men and single mothers and those that were sick, people that literally had no home or family. She would create home and family for them. What was neat about it, she not only said, come and receive, she'd say right away, come and receive and also contribute. Because she knew that people's healing was partly found in being givers themselves. Created many havens of hope. Now, she would use these homes during World War II. So in 1940, the Germans, the Nazis, move into France, and the city is full of refugees and people who are suffering. And so she would welcome them in her homes. They would be packed. And then as pressure from the Nazis became greater and greater on the Jewish people there, she began to hide her Jewish friends and their friends in her homes and then use this elaborate system of friends to get them out of the country. That became harder and harder to do. And so they continued to adapt the way that they would care for their Jewish friends. And by the way, she was one of a few Christians during World War II that believed it was their duty to stand against the Nazis and with their Jewish brothers and sisters. She was just like Dietrich Bonhoeffer in that way. This is what they did. They would forge church membership records to show names of these Jewish people, and also forged Christian baptismal certificates that they would give to their Jewish friends so that they might not be gathered up and sent away. On one occasion, she was criticized by one of those spiritual leaders that was above her, the man. Okay, we'll just call him the man. And he'd say, how do you explain your dishonesty? Lying about this. And she said, I am simply doing what I can imagine Jesus doing. He threatened to remove her from her post, but yet she had this clarity and defiance against bad advice and kept doing what she was doing. In 1945, she was arrested along with her son, so she had two other kids. What's neat is her son was joining her in this really dangerous work. They did it together. He was arrested. She was arrested. They would both die separate in different concentration camps. She was sent to Ravensbrück in northern Germany, where she spent the last 2 years of her life. And while she was in camp, prisoners that survived said that she continued to be the mother that she wanted to be for all people. A source of light and hope and comfort. Her last act of love on earth was certainly that of what a mother would do. It was the most generous and brave thing she ever did. Just days before the war ended, the Nazis were selecting random people to be killed each day in the gas chambers. And one day, a woman that Mary knew was selected, and she began to panic. And Mary, even without thinking, stepped forward and voluntarily took the place of this young woman who survived and stood in the gas chamber in her place. Her friends said that she would have been proud to say this of her, that she had given herself to the Holocaust. John chapter 15, verses 12 and 13 probably was on her mind as she did this. This is my command, love one another as I love you. No one has greater love than this, that they would lay down one's life for one's friends. Metropolitan Anthony Bloom, which that's just a title for like the Archbishop, the Orthodox faith, said she was a leader that transcended the political world. Remember, she cared so much about it. That was the answer, but then she transcended it and found a better way to change the world. She was a saint for our day who stood face to face with the problems of our century. She was a treasure. And she was a mother in many ways. And so, I got through all of those. Thank you for letting me geek out on history for one day. This is what I want us to just see as we look at all of them together. These were all ladies who were striking and dazzling and beautiful and inspiring. And they had a deep inner reservoir of character and virtue that only comes from going back to Jesus over and over again to care for your needs. And because of that, they would express this new life over and over again with courage and grace and love and sacrifice. It would look different for each one, yet it was the same character, the life of God shining through them. And they're real heroes. And they're part of the great cloud of witnesses that are meant to be around us to inspire us to keep going. Now, as the worship team comes out, we're going to end by singing a song together. But we want to bless the moms in the room. And not only do we want to bless the moms in the room, but we want to bless all the women in the room, because every one of you has the high calling to be a mother in some way, to nurture a soul, even if you don't have your own kids. So I invite everyone to stand up together. And I want to make sure that there's not a single lady in the room that's kind of off by herself. So if you are, kind of move towards someone else so someone can put their hand on your shoulder. And, for some people, this is kind of weird, praying and blessing each other, which it is if you've never done it. I'm with you. But where else does this kind of thing happen, right? If people who pray can't pray for one another, when can it happen? And so I want to make sure every mom, every woman, every woman that has the potential to live out the high calling of motherhood, I want you to be prayed for. So let's bless one another today. Let's bless these ladies. Father, first of all, we want to thank you for the way that you love and shape the world. And it's actually a very intimate and beautiful thing that you use people and nurturers and shepherds and parents and fathers and mothers to do that. You don't want love to get lost in the big project of making all things new. And so today, Lord, we want to honor you, and we also want to honor the role of motherhood in our culture, in our world, and today. And so we lift up every woman, every girl in this room, and we thank you for the strong feminine virtue that you have placed inside of them. It's part of your very character. And God, we ask that you would fill each woman with your spirit of courage and humility and power and strength, so that they might let their light shine. They have a treasure inside. And treasures are meant to be shared, not to be buried. And so, God, I pray against comparison and the shame that many mothers experience, and the worry about not doing enough, I pray that you would release them from that, knowing that your grace is enough to fill in the gaps for all of us. But you would release them from that so that they might be excited about serving and loving. We think of the people that are in their care, men and women, boys and girls. And we ask that you would give each of these ladies what they need to love and shape those souls well. So fill them with insight, fill them with courage and wisdom that they might love as you do. Father, we are grateful for the women who have touched our lives. We bless them and ask for more and more of it. May this be a community that celebrates and honors the right things. So let this beauty continue, and we bless every woman in this room.